In part one of this series on literature and consciousness, I talked about the writer and how writing comes out of one's inner silence. Now in this second part, I'd like to talk about the reader. So what if our enjoyment and appreciation and understanding of literature could be heightened, expanded? What if we could get more out of everything we read and see? Why not? In a talk that Maharishi calls the quantum theory of literature, which appears in the Flow of Consciousness, it's one of the talks transcribed in the book, Maharishi says that the reader or student of literature should have at least as high a state of consciousness as the writer, preferably higher, he says, because then he will derive greater inspiration, he will derive greater charm and greater meaning, he will derive greater inspired evolution through whatever he reads. So for any student of literature, the first thing is to have as high a level of consciousness, as pure a level of consciousness as possible. Now, one area in which a reader might like to be more knowledgeable is in states of consciousness. We are familiar with the first three states of consciousness: waking, sleep, dreaming, but there are 7. So let's consider a fourth state of consciousness, the one Wordsworth describes in his poem Tintern Abbey. Now I spoke about this briefly in the first talk, but I'd like to go a little more deeply into it this time. He describes his inner experience in a very exact physiological manner. So let me just repeat those few lines. He says, "Until the breath of this corporeal frame, and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things." Now, research on the transcending individual can shed some light on Wordsworth's experience. Research subjects practicing the transcendental meditation technique were asked to press a button just as they came out of this silent inner state, because while they were in that silent inner state, they weren't able to press a button or even think the thought, now I'm there. They were just in that unbounded state. So they were instructed, when they came out of it, press the button. And then the scientists could look back at their breath rate, their heart rate, and their brainwave coherence in the period just preceding that button press. So what did they find? While they were in that transcendental state, their breath rate slowed and sometimes stopped for as long as 40 seconds. Now, this isn't a bad thing, because it's not like holding your breath, because there's no lack of oxygen in the bloodstream and there's no gasping for breath afterwards as one would do if one were holding one's breath. So the breath of this corporeal frame almost suspended. That's what Wordsworth is talking about. It's a literal physiological experience. Then their heart rate also slowed down, and researchers saw decreased cardiac output, meaning less blood was flowing out of the heart. Again, not a bad thing. Just the natural evidence of a state of deep relaxation, deep rest. We are laid asleep in body, Wordsworth says. But here's the thing. Asleep in body, but become a living soul. What does that mean? Well, during the transcending process, researchers see EEG coherence across all frequency bands and between all cerebral cortical areas. The brain is awake and coherent, even though the body is as if asleep. And Wordsworth says, while with an eye, that's the inner eye, made quiet, coherent, by the power of harmony, there's coherence, and the deep power of joy. Yes, let's not forget joy, the deep power of joy. Because this state is blissful, unbounded, all-knowing. Pure consciousness, inner silence, is the innermost life of everything. Sometimes we can see into the life of things. Now, Wordsworth's description is not fanciful or merely poetic. No. The poet's sensibility and his gift of language have given us a point-by-point description of the process of transcending and the experience of the fourth state of consciousness, transcendental consciousness. The reader can recognize a state not as a poetic fancy, but as an actual experience. This is useful knowledge for the reader, for the student of literature. Now, with repeated experience of the fourth state of consciousness, say through TM technique, one develops the ability to maintain it along with activity, along with thinking, even sleeping and dreaming. One becomes the witness, the unbounded witness to what one experiences. Now, listen to the American writer Henry David Thoreau, the author of Walden, as he describes such an experience that occurred to him naturally. He says, "I only know myself as a human entity, the scene, so to speak, of thoughts and affections, and am sensible of a certain doubleness by which I can stand as remote from myself as from another. However intense my experience, I am conscious of the presence and criticism of a part of me, which, as it were, is not a part of me, but spectator, sharing no experience, taking note of it, and that is no more I than it is you." So there he's recognizing that maybe it's something more universal than a specific I or a specific you. It's a natural experience, if rare, but we should be able to recognize it for what it is. Here's a poem by the modern Hispanic writer Juan Ramon Jimenez, which makes a little bit more sense in the light of that knowledge, I think. He says, "I am not I. I am this one who goes by my side, unseen by me, whom I at times go visit, and whom I at times forget. He who keeps silent, serene, when I speak. He who forgives, sweet, when I hate. He who takes a walk where I am not. He who will remain standing when I die." So what can this mean, if not describing the witness, the unbounded self that accompanies the doer? At times, he says, until the state is fully established, that second self is invisible, he says, unseen by me, silent, serene, sweet, forgiving, and will remain standing after death. Now, here's another poem you might enjoy. This one by the contemporary American poet Mary Oliver. It's called Sleeping in the Forest, but it's not so much about sleeping as being awake inside from time to time and enjoying a very subtle perception, perhaps the qualities of the state that Maharishi calls the sixth state, or God consciousness. She calls it sleeping in the forest. "I thought the earth remembered me. She took me back so tenderly, arranging her dark skirts, her pockets full of lichens and seeds. I slept as never before, alone on a riverbed, nothing between me and the white fire of the stars but my thoughts, and they floated, light as moths, among the branches of the perfect trees. All night I heard the small kingdoms breathing around me, the insects and the birds who do their work in the darkness. All night I rose and fell as if in water, grappling with a luminous doom. By morning, I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better. The trees are perfect. She can hear the breathing of the insects and birds. Isn't this subtle perception? And the rising and falling as if in water. One does this in sleep, but the words luminous doom bring the idea of an inner light into that darkness. And what is the something better into which she vanishes from time to time? Pure unbounded consciousness, perhaps. Now, fully developed enlightenment, what Maharishi calls unity consciousness, is a state where the knower, the self, identifies with the greater self, the basis of all creation, all life. And one can have this unity experience in flashes long before the state is established as an all-time reality, however rare these experiences may be. Now consider this poem by the modern American poet Kenneth Rexroth. He calls it The Heart of Heracles, or Hercules. It's from his book, The Lights in the Sky Are Stars. He mentions Deneb in the poem. Now, Deneb is a large star which can be seen by the naked eye. And he mentions the cluster of Hercules, which is visible through a telescope. All the rest needs no explaining, except that he is describing a unique and profound state of consciousness. The heart of Heracles, lying under the stars in the summer night, late, while the autumn constellations climb the sky. As the cluster of Hercules falls down the west, I put the telescope by and watched Deneb move toward the zenith. My body is asleep. Only my eyes and brain are awake. The stars stand around me like gold eyes. I can no longer tell where I begin and leave off. The faint breeze in the dark pines and the invisible grass, the tipping earth, the swarming stars, have an eye that sees itself. Beautiful. Like Wordsworth, his body seems to be asleep. Is this an echo of Wordsworth? Possibly. And his eyes and brain are awake. Unlike Wordsworth, his eyes are open and taking in the night sky. His brain is awake, aware of the invisible but present grass and the faint breeze. And he's aware of the earth that he lies upon, tipping as the night moves along to reveal the later stars and constellations. And he feels unbounded. He says, I can no longer tell where I begin and leave off. And in that state, he experiences that he is the universe. He is the tipping earth, the swarming stars. And his eye is looking out onto his greater self. The universe has an eye, his eye, and it can look upon itself through that eye. He says, the faint breeze in the dark pines and the invisible grass, the tipping earth, the swarming stars, have an eye that sees itself. Now, in this volume, The Flow of Consciousness, I put in the appendix a brief description of states of consciousness with some illustrations from some writers to fill in that aspect of it. So that's there as an appendix in The Flow of Consciousness, 7 states of consciousness. So we see what the knowledge of states of consciousness can bring to the reading and enjoyment of literature. Maharishi points out that when students of literature have that transcendental pure consciousness available to them and developing in their lives, then their understanding and appreciation of literature will be enhanced, he says. As consciousness becomes clearer, it will become more flexible, more fluid. It will be able to comprehend wider horizons of all the mechanics of a literary piece. This is also from the quantum theory of literature. And as students practice the TM technique, researchers find that they do develop creativity, increased intelligence, increased emotional intelligence, increased fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence, that's the ability to do abstract reasoning, to solve problems in novel situations, not just book learning situations. And it is relevant that the TM technique reduces stress and anxiety. Since literature is the flow of consciousness, the flow of life, then, Maharishi says, one could enjoy the flow of life if the awareness which actually flows is really crystal clear fluid. On a frozen level of consciousness, the flow is not available. Stressed minds can hardly flow with any purity. So let me close with another quote by Maharishi from quantum theory. And he says, when we know literature to be the flow of consciousness, the flow of life, the flow of nature, the flow of infinity, totality, then we have to study it on the ground of that infinite, unbounded, total value of consciousness. So next, we have discussed in parts 1 and 2 the reader and the writer. In part 3, I'd like to talk about the mechanics of literature, how literature actually creates an evolutionary experience in the reader.